At the heart of every story are 5 key elements: characters, setting, plot, conflict, and resolution. The most important of these 5 elements is characters, because every other element that makes up a story stems from its characters. A story can have any number of characters, but there are only 2 that actually drive a story: the protagonist and antagonist. These characters decide where the story will take place, what events will happen, what conflicts will occur, and how the story will be resolved. It's generally accepted that a story will have just one protagonist and one antagonist. This is the rule that has dictated how stories have been told since the Epic of Gilgamesh was written over 4,000 years ago. So this begs the question, how the heck did Grand Theft Auto 5 get away with having not 1, not 2, but 3 playable protagonists? And not only that, but how did it do it so well that it went on to be voted Game of the Year in 2013? Now, GTA 5 was certainly not the first video game to include multiple playable characters, but it is perhaps the best game to ever do it, which is very impressive given the challenges that arise from introducing multiple protagonists. So how does a video game go about handling these complications to create one cohesive story? It all starts with setting expectations in the first act. The first act of any story is by far the most important. It acts as the story's hook for the player, it establishes the ordinary world and who the protagonist and antagonist are, and it also incites the story's overarching conflict. But the first act also does something else that is less obvious but no less important. It teaches the player what to expect from the game. Within the first 2 minutes of GTA 5, the player is already introduced to the game's mechanic of switching between characters during the doomed Ludendorff robbery when the player must switch to Trevor to save Michael. The game sets this expectation early so the player sees it as only natural when they later play as Franklin. A great example of a game that didn't set this standard in the first act is LA Noire. Out of the base game's 21 cases, the player controls protagonist Cole Phelps for all but 2.5 of them. After playing over 85% of the game as Cole Phelps, the player switches to Jack Kelso for 2.5 cases to finish out the game. This character switch so late in the third act is completely unexpected and jarring because the game never prepared the player to expect such a switch. And given the game switched to Jack Kelso for only 2.5 cases, it would have greatly benefited from keeping the player switch mechanic out of the game completely. Given that the player controls Cole Phelps for so much of the game makes it his story, meaning the player should finish the game as him. But setting the expectation is only the first part of having multiple playable protagonists. The story itself still needs to handle having the multiple settings, plots, conflicts, and resolutions that arise from including these different characters. Each protagonist will have his or her own life going on with their own individual plots and conflicts already taking place. At the start of the game, Michael is handling personal and familial issues, Franklin is dealing with his corrupt car salesman boss, and Trevor is doing Trevor things. Each of our protagonists not only have their own storylines already happening, they're not even physically located near each other. Michael is in the northern part of Los Santos, Franklin all the way across town, and Trevor is way up north in Sandy Shores. So how does a game bring these 3 characters together? This is where GTA 5 really shines. It all starts with Michael DeSanta. Regardless of how many protagonists a story has, it will always have the main protagonist, due to the simple fact that every story must start with someone. In Grand Theft Auto 5, the player begins the game as Michael DeSanta, which makes Michael the story's narrative anchor. Michael is the character around which the story pivots, and is the force that attracts the unlikely partnership between Trevor Phillips and Franklin Clinton. If it weren't for Michael, the Sandy Shores-based Trevor and the South Los Santos-based Franklin would likely never meet. GTA 5 makes sure to establish the most important relationship in the game between Michael and Trevor early in the Ludendorff bank robbery flashback. This mission not only sets the precedent for the switchable characters game mechanic, but also constructs the first link between 2 of our 3 protagonists. And since the flashback is from 9 years earlier, it shows these 2 characters already have a history, so the game doesn't have to work very hard to reunite them. While it's a more difficult task to quickly establish a link between Franklin, given he's a total stranger, to the other 2 protagonists, the game manages to do this in a very slick way. Once the game moves back to the present day, it makes sure to stick with Michael in Dr. Freelander's office to remind the player he's the narrative anchor. As Michael leaves his therapist, he has a strange encounter with 2 men who turn out to be Franklin and Lamar. In a seamless transition, the game leaves Michael in the background to go back to his own troubled life, and allows the player to follow Franklin and learn his problems. The relationship between Michael and Franklin isn't quite fully established here, but the groundwork is certainly laid down. This intro shows that while Michael and Franklin don't yet know each other, they run in the same circles and will likely meet again. Now, when Franklin attempts to repossess Michael's son's car, there's already a history between the 2 characters, which likely keeps Michael from shooting Franklin. And after Franklin is forced to drive into Simeon's car dealership, the game switches back to Michael, but only after the second character link has been established. Now that both Trevor and Franklin have been connected to our narrative anchor, it makes sense these 2 would meet early in the second act when the trio break into the IAA building. This establishes the third and final character link between Trevor and Franklin and completes the triangle, allowing the game's story to develop through the second act and into the third. The game manages to do all this within the first couple hours of gameplay. Grand Theft Auto 5 is an absolute masterclass in not just video game storytelling, but storytelling in general. The game does a fantastic job in the first act of guiding the player through the maze of backstory, multiple settings, and various storylines happening. There's simply no way GTA 5 would have had the success it had if it had waited longer to introduce the player switch mechanic or build links between its protagonists. It's a perfect example of a game quickly bringing the player up to speed so it can get on to developing its story as soon as possible. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, hit the subscribe button, and click the notification bell to stay up to date on future game playthroughs and game breakdowns on the channel. Peace.